Welcome back. In this video, we will look at factory constructors in Dart. So I've got this definition of what is a factory constructor from this website, learndartprogramming.com, fundamentals, factory constructor in Dart. So they say there that a factory keyword is used when implementing constructors that do not create new instances of the existing class. Because if you're going to create new instances of the existing class, you will be using normal constructors. So a factory constructor can return value from cache or from an instance of a subtype. So from cache means the object already exists, it was already created, and you're just referencing it back. And an instance of a subtype, that's where inheritance came in, that we already covered. Factory constructor does not have access to the this keyword, because if you're going to use the this keyword, you're probably going to use it to construct an object, so you're going to use the normal constructors. Factory constructors are like static methods whose return type is the class itself. So the return type for it should be the class itself. Proper use case of factory constructors. Use the factory constructor when creating a new instance of an existing class is too expensive. You can also create only one instance of the class, or use it to create only one instance of the class. And in this case, this is basically your singleton. So if you want to create a singleton, you can also use your factory constructor. For returning subclass instance of the class instead of the class itself. So if you've got a superclass, and inside of the superclass you can have a factory constructor that return back objects of the subclasses instead of itself. Right, so the example that we will do today is basically this last one, where we will be returning subclass instances of the class instead of the class itself. But we're going to make it a bit interesting. So let's just have a quick look at what I pasted here at the bottom. And this is basically a JSON file that I got off the internet, or a part of a JSON file. So JSON is JavaScript object notation. And most servers online use that to send through data to the server and also get data back. So this could be data that we got from a server somewhere to get back data like the first name of a user, the last name, the gender, the age, the address. And if you look at this, it looks a lot like one of the structures we already did. In fact, it is exactly one of the structures we did previously, which is called the map. So you'll see there's a key and there's a value pair. And so we've got keys and values. So for this one, there's the key and the value is another map. This one, there's the key and the value is a list, and inside of the list we will probably have some maps. So even going and defining this as, let's say, values equals, and I'm placing it inside of a list for myself, close the list on that side, end it off with a semicolon, and you can see the type of this list by hovering over it. It's a map where the key will be of type string and the value will be an object. Now we've already done the object class, so you already know what this object is all about. So just to show you that this is an actual JSON file from the internet and that we can actually use it to read back data into my classes. Okay, so this is the example that we will do today, is to return subclass instances of the class instead of the class itself, but looking also at maybe reading data from a JSON file. And in this case, I'm not going to connect to the internet to get it. We will create the factory constructor to accept that type of data type, like a map, and then it will use the map to create subclass instances. Right, so before we start, I've created a factory constructor project folder, and inside of it, I just have factory constructor. And I'm going to do everything in one class, so it's easier for you to see what's going on. But remember that you can do this in separate classes as well, or in separate files with each file having another class. Right, so you can go to your browser and just type in bit.ly and then factory constructors like that. And if you click on it, it should take you to this gist, which is .bat. You've got class reading, you've got class temperature, you've got class pressure, and we've got an example of something that could come from a server. So I want you to take everything in this file, copy it, and let's paste it in here. Right, so this is what we've got. We've got class reading. Now, if I look at class reading, it's basically going to have a value with the constructor, the normal default constructor. We take in the value which will be required, and we set this dot value, which is the value at the top, to the value that was passed in. Then we've got a named constructor here, reading.0, which will basically set the value to a -999. And you'll see where we're going to use that later on. Basically saying there was an error that came from the server and we will set the value to -999. Okay. And then we've got the toString method that I'm overriding for this superclass called reading, and it will just return the value. Right, so let's go to temperature now. Class temperature extends reading, which means it will also inherit this value. Now you can have a look at what I've done here is to not have this one private. So a lot of times in Dart or in Flutter also, we do not declare these variables as private. So I wanted to create an example also where we do not have it as private. And the nice thing about not having it as private is that I can actually go there and instead of saying require double value there, I can just say this dot value. And then I can even remove this part that initializes it. And it will automatically initialize it by saying this dot value should be passed in with a required named argument called value. So actually it's doing the same as what we did previously now. So if I undo this, it's doing exactly the same as what we have there. You will have a name argument called value, and your value that was passed into the constructor will be set to your instance variable at the top. So this is just a shorter way of doing this by saying this dot value, and then you can remove the initializer part. And we could do the same for temperature also. So I'm going to leave the rest as it is, but just note that there's a shorter way to do this and a quicker way if you wanted to. Right, let's look at temperature quickly. Temperature extends reading. This will have a city field, and the temperature constructor will take in the city field as required and the reading as required, because remember, because temperature extends reading, we will need to set the value as well, and we will get that value in, and we're going to call it reading. Okay, and then we're going to set the city field that was passed in to the city at the top, and we're going to call super passing in the value of reading, which will call this constructor passing in that reading, and it's going to set the value. So then for temperature, the value has been set and the city has been set using this constructor. Now for the 0 named constructor, as we did there, we set the value to -999. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to set the city as empty, and we're going to set the value as -999. Now there's also a toString method, and the toString method will return temperature reading, then go to a new line. It will say reading, and it will go to super.toString. Super.toString will just return back the value, and it will go to a new line and say city, and then display the city. Right, so that's the toString method for temperature and the class temperature. Now let's go to pressure, because pressure is also another type of reading. So remember, there's an is-a relationship. Temperature is a reading. Now for pressure is a reading as well, and we will have an object that we would test for the pressure. For the pressure constructor, we'll accept that object that was tested as a string and also the reading again. And we will set the object there at the top to the value that was passed in to the constructor. And we'll also call the superclass constructor to pass through the reading, which it will set then to double value. Then again, the 0 named argument, we will set the object tested as nothing, and we will go to the superclass constructor, pass in the value of -999, so that we know that somewhere something went wrong. Right, then there's the toString method also. We will say pressure reading. Here we said temperature reading, and we will say reading. Super.toString will just return the value, which is the reading, and it will then have a new line and say object tested and show the object that was tested. Right, so let's say in the main method now, we've got a JSON file that looks something like this. We've got it from the server. Let's say somewhere from the server we've read in the data, and now this is the data that we got back from the server. Some JSON data where we've got the type is temp. There you can see again the type is pressure. There the type is temp. There the type is pressure. All of them has got a reading, and all of them, or some of them, has got a city, and some of them has got an object. So it's basically the same data type in here, because all of them are maps inside of a list, but the keys are different for some of these maps. So if it's a temperature reading, we will have the reading and we've got the city. You'll see there's another temperature one. We have a reading and we've got the city. For the pressure, we will have a reading and we'll have an object on where you've got that data from. And also this one is from a tire and that one is from a gas cylinder. So that's pressure and temperature. So what we want to do now is to create a factory constructor for the class called reading that will create temperature and pressure objects looking at the data that we have here, which means if the type is temp, we will create a temperature object. If the type is pressure, we're going to create a pressure object. Now let's just look at the data type that we're going to pass into the factory constructor, and it will basically be this from server that we're going to pass in. And you can see this from server is a list of maps where the keys are strings and the values are of type object. Right, so let's go and create our factory method there, or our factory constructor. So it will be inside of this reading class. So inside of the reading class, we will have to use the factory keyword there in order to make this a factory constructor. I'm going to say reading, which is the class name, dot, and let's just call this one from server. Now we can have opening and closing braces there. And if I hover over this, it says the body might complete normally, causing null to be returned, but the return type is potentially non-nullable. And you can see the return type is now of type reading, which means we must return a reading object back. So we'll get to the return statements and then this error will disappear. So don't worry too much now. We'll get to that. Now reading from server, we will pass in a map like we've seen before. And the map will be a key of type string and a value of type object. And let's call this server. So basically what we will be doing is to pass in a map of key, string, and value object. And that's exactly what we have here. So at the end, we can just pass in that from server to the factory method, and then we can assign objects to it. So now the first thing that we need to do is to get the type back from this data type. So from the server, we need to get the type. So all of them has got a type. So that's quite easy. We know we will not get a problem there because we will always get back the correct type. So I'm going to say, go to server that was passed in, which is now this one from server. That one that was passed in, go to the specific key called type and get the key for me. So now we've got the key, and by supplying the key, I will get back the value. Now all of them has also got a reading. So we can also get the reading from all of them. So I'm going to say final reading equals server, and let's get the reading. So by supplying the key there, we will get back the value, which will be the reading. Right, then we will use a simple switch statement in order to look at the type. So remember, the type can now either be temp, so I'm going to have case temp there, and the other case will be, if you look at the bottom one, there's temp and there's pressure. So those are the two values that we can get back from this line, server type. So if it's temp, now look at temp quickly. If the type is temperature, the other value that we can get back is the city. For pressure, the other value is object. So for both of these, inside of the switch, we will try and get back that value as well. So let's get back the city first. So I'm going to say var city, well, I can even say final city equals server, and let's get back city. So why can I do that? Because I know if the type is temp, we will have a city. So it won't give me an error there. Right, so we've got the city value there, and now we can test. If the city that was passed in is in fact a string, and we know the reading is a double, then we can actually return something. So we can say return a new temperature object. Now let's select it. The city will be the city, and the reading will be the reading. So that's 100% fine. So why am I doing this? I'm checking if the value is a string and the readings value is a double. Because if it's anything else, as the city there, for example, if the city is not a string and the reading is not a double, then what we're trying to do here doesn't make sense. So that's the else part now. So let's go to the else. We will return temperature dot 0. So what will temperature dot 0 do now? So if we go back to the temperature class, temperature dot 0 will set the city as empty and will make the value a minus 999. So then basically something went wrong, and we will just print it out as a minus 999, and we will see that that specific one has got an error for us. Okay, so this is for temperature. Now let's do the next case. So it's going to be case pressure. Now let's do the same thing. I'm going to have final, but in the case of the pressure now, we are getting back an object, which is a gas cylinder or a tire or whatever. So we're going to use final, let's say final object equals, go to server, and get back the object. So the key is object, and it will return back the value. So the key there is object, and it will return back gas cylinder or tire. Now I'm going to do exactly the same type of if statement there. So I'm going to copy this whole if statement there with the else. And instead of saying city there, we're going to change it to object. So if the object is a string and the reading is a double, same as what we did there, then return, but instead of saying now a temperature object, we will have a pressure object. And the pressure object will be, or will have the object tested, which is called object. So let's change it to object. And it will also take in the reading and set the reading. The else part will be, instead of saying temperature.0, we will say pressure.0. And what will pressure.0 do? Same thing, make the object empty and pass to super minus 999. Right, and then for the case, we've got temperature, we've got pressure, but what if this type is in fact not a temperature or a pressure? Then obviously we can also not do anything there. So let's just have a default value there quickly. And for default, we will just return back a reading, normal reading object, but we will set it to 0, which means it's going to return back a minus 999 if it's not of the correct type. Right, and all of a sudden, we see that that error disappeared. So that error will stay with you until you've got all the different cases worked out and you're actually returning the type reading. So if you hover over this from server, you see it must return back the type called reading. Now, why am I able to return back temperature and pressure? Because remember what we said, there's an is a relationship. So temperature is a reading. So sending back temperature is in fact the same type as reading. Or it could be seen as the same type because it extends reading, which means temperature is a reading and pressure is a reading. So that's why it's allowed for me to actually send back a subclass version, and it will be fine to return back that reading. Right, so let's see how we can use it now in the main method. So after we declared that from server, we can go and say var readings equals, and let's just start off with an empty reading list. So readings, if you hover over it, will be a list of reading objects. And remember, reading objects means I can have any object of this class type, any object of temperature, and any object of pressure, because all of them is in fact reading objects. Okay, so there's a list of readings, and let's run through every item inside of this list called from server. Var item in from server. And what I want to do is to take every item that is inside of this list of items, take every item and go to readings, which is this list of reading objects that's currently empty, and I want to add them into there. So I will say reading, and you'll see there's my from server factory constructor. So I'm going to choose that one, and I'm going to pass in, look at the value that it accepts. You can see it accepts a map where the key will be of type string and the value will be of type object. So in this case, exactly what we have here, and every one of these items, this one, this one, this one, and so forth, let me just undo that, will be every one of these items. So we are passing in the item there. So what will this do now? It will run this for loop for 1, 2, 3, 4 times because there's 4 values in it. Every time it runs, it's going to send these 4 items to the from server factory constructor. And that constructor will now decide what type of object to create, either temperature or pressure, or if it doesn't make sense, it will just create a reading object. Okay, so let's go down. So after that, we will have all of the objects of type reading inside of this list, and it will hold temperature as well as pressure objects. So let's print out that one. So we're going to say for var reading in readings. And let's just print it out. So we'll say print reading. Now, by the way, what will happen when we just print out every object? It will run the toString methods. So for example, for the temperature class, it's going to run this toString and print out temperature reading with a new line, the reading, getting the reading value, and then the city. For pressure, it will do this, just the pressure reading, new line, show the reading, show the object. And then if you print out a reading, it will just print out the value. And the only time we've used that is basically if we're using this .0 there, and you've seen we've used it there. So if the type is not pressure or temp, then we will get that -999. Okay, so let's run this quickly and see how it runs. All right, so let's look at this. Okay, so if we go back to this JSON file there, you can see that we've got the type temperature. So the first one will be temperature reading. The reading is 20.2 and the city is Johannesburg. Second one is pressure. The reading is 100 and the object is gas cylinder. And you can see for the other two also, it printed out everything nicely. So let's say for the first, or let's say the last one, we remove the E there, which means that's not a type. That should be correct. We run it now again. You will see the first three prints out fine, and then the last one just prints -999. So if we get that, we know that the type somewhere was not correct. And let's say the object there, we changed the object here to 200, which is not a string. And if we run it again, which one is that? That's the last one. You can see then we get the reading of -999 and the object tested is empty. And now because we did this with a reading of -999, we can actually say, well, if reading.value, now look at this, this is also interesting. If I put the dot there on reading, you will see that I have got only access to value there. And that is because the type that we have here is reading. And for the reading class, there's only one value, and I've got access to that value only. Okay, so I'm going to say if the reading.value is in fact -999.0, but instead of saying equals, we will say not equal to. So what this will do is it will not print out then these with the reading that's got -999. So if I run this again, I will only get my valid values. And this is what you call a factory constructor. So what did our factory constructor do? In fact, if we look at this, we did the last one there that says for returning subclass instances of a class instead of the class itself. So we returned back temperature and pressure objects depending on specific values. And you would have had a hard time doing exactly this with a normal constructor. Hope you've learned something from this video. See you in the next one.